Hi everyone. In this unit, we're going to discuss learning. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior as the result of experience. In this video, we're going to spend most of our time on the basic principles of classical and operant conditioning. There are some sections of the text that I won't talk about in this video, but you should take careful care to learn them from the text. Psychological theories of learning are primarily based in the concepts of association, or associative learning. Associative learning is an instinct, whereby we pair things that happen together in both space and time. The classic example of associative learning is thunder and lightning. Once you've seen the flash of lightning paired with the loud noise of thunder, over time you'll develop a relationship between those two things that might temporarily change your behavior such that when you see a nearby flash of lightning, you'll wince in preparation for the coming thunder. That's learning. Learning theory, as you know, takes on the behaviorist perspective of psychology. This is the idea that what goes on in the human mind, the conscious experience that we've been talking about in the last couple of chapters, is just so subjective that it's unknowable. Skinner famously described it as a black box. What you can see, however, are the stimuli that go in and the responses that come out of an organism. And if you can predict those things, say the behaviorists, you can produce any kind of behavior. Ivan Pavlov's famous experiment with the salivation of dogs is detailed in the textbook. Instead of using that as an example for the principles of classical conditioning, let's use another. One of the important things to understand about learning is that we can often learn to pair stimuli that are unrelated to each other. So take a look at this example. The first thing I want you to notice is the US, or the unconditioned stimulus. Now, what we typically mean by unconditioned is that whatever this stimulus or response, as we'll get to in a moment, is natural. It occurs without the intervention of any kind of necessary learning. That is, it's probably instinctive. And what I mean by stimulus is something that evokes a response, some cue. In the case of this example, the US, or the unconditioned stimulus, is a passionate kiss. The unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response, that is, a natural response to that stimulus. In the case of the unconditioned stimulus of a passionate kiss, the unconditioned response is sexual arousal. This is a natural instinctive pairing. When learning comes in is when we pair things with this natural response, when some neutral stimulus that isn't associated either with the unconditioned stimulus or the unconditioned response comes in and sort of piggybacks on that unconditioned stimulus. In order for that to happen, for us to use those associative processes that are natural, this unconditioned stimulus must be paired with the neutral stimulus. And once those two things appear together in space and time with enough frequency, what happens is that the neutral stimulus takes on the properties of the unconditioned stimulus. That is, it evokes the same response or the same type of response as the unconditioned stimulus. In this case, our neutral stimulus that becomes a conditioned stimulus over the process of learning is onion breath. If, say, for instance, you're dating a partner who just loves Funyuns. Let's say you're dating a partner that just loves onions and has them on everything, and you have been dying to be with them, and all of a sudden you start a relationship, and the relationship, as many do, starts off very passionate, and constantly this taste and smell of onions is being paired with something very positive, with this unconditioned stimulus of a passionate kiss. Over time, that smell of onion breath takes on the qualities, helps you prepare for the unconditioned response, which transforms that unconditioned response into a conditioned response. So at the end of the learning process, you have a conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that previously was unassociated, and a conditioned response, a response that previously was not evoked by this stimulus. You can really think of it this way. The process of classical conditioning is the process of giving you a cue for some natural instinctive behavior. When we learn something, we go through a process called acquisition. This is the period during which the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, during which the conditioned stimulus begins to evoke the conditioned response. the more times that the neutral stimulus, that is the onion breath, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the passionate kiss, the more strongly the onion breath, the conditioned stimulus, will evoke the sexual arousal, the conditioned response, in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus, the kiss. Let's say, for instance, you break up, maybe because you just can't handle the onion breath. Over time, and in fact rather quickly, the presentation of the conditioned stimulus, the onion breath, without the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that really naturally produces the response, will result in the extinction of that link. That is, the conditioned stimulus will no longer produce the conditioned response. What's interesting about learning is that those associations lie dormant. For example, you break up and stop talking to one another, and then you meet up one evening, you get back together, and there's a very quick reacquisition phase because those stimuli are still paired together latently. That is, it's easier to relearn something than it is to learn it for the first time. So classical conditioning is all about pairing a neutral stimulus with some instinctive, natural, unconditioned response and linking those things together. What that means, though, for classical conditioning is that it's limited to cueing things that are instinctually related. That is, it's really difficult to use the principles of classical conditioning to train a behavior in an animal that is not natural. For example, to teach a dolphin to jump through a hoop at a sea park. Instead, that type of learning uses operant processes. So this is the distinction between classical and operant conditioning, which we'll talk about next, where classical conditioning relies on instinctual relationships between unconditioned stimuli. Operant conditioning allows the training of non-natural behaviors. B.F. Skinner is the name most associated with operant learning and operant conditioning. And these operant chambers are sort of colloquially known as Skinner boxes. These chambers were designed to help us understand the ways in which animals learn. If I want to teach a rat to press a lever to get fed, that's a non-natural behavior. Rats don't have levers in the wild that produce food for them. So there's no unconditioned stimulus really to work with here. Instead, I have to condition a chain of stimuli to encourage an animal to do a behavior that's non-natural. But even though operant conditioning can help train non-natural behaviors, we have to begin with the natural behaviors of the animal, because that's all they do. So when a rat, for instance, is placed in an operant chamber, its natural behavior is to explore. Operant conditioning is the process where we reinforce certain behaviors and punish other behaviors in order to shape an animal's behavior towards the desired behavior. So I'll walk you through a classic Skinner box experiment. An animal enters the chamber and begins exploring. Over the course of several days, that animal's behavior is shaped towards pressing the lever. Remember that word from your text. That shaping is moving through successive approximations of the behavior I want, the animal pressing the lever, from its natural behavior. When the animal is exploring, I might begin by reinforcing the animal anytime it's in the right half of the cage. That is, anytime it's in the half of the cage near the lever. When the animal is on that half of the cage, I can hit a button that will distribute a food pellet. Over time, the animal begins spending more time in that half of the cage because it recognizes, it associates the behavior of being in that half of the cage with receiving food. Eventually, I'll need to encourage that animal to take another step towards the behavior I want. So I will stop reinforcing the animal when it's only in the right half of the cage and will only reinforce it when it's under the lever, when it's right up next to it. That means its exploratory behaviors will also be primarily focused in that part of the cage. So through this process, I can shape the animal towards spending more time in the right part of the cage, towards only reinforcing it when it touches the lever, and then eventually, as it explores, its weight will push the lever itself. Over the course of a couple of days, an animal can be trained to push a lever to receive food. The reinforcement I'm applying associates certain behaviors, natural or unnatural, with receiving a good reward, or avoiding, in some cases, a punishment. This is one of the most difficult concepts in the chapter, so I wanted to take just a few minutes to make sure you understand the differences between negative and positive punishment and reinforcement. So far, when we've been talking about operant conditioning, we've been talking about reinforcement, ways to increase the probability of a given behavior. That's all reinforcement is something that is intended to increase the probability of a behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, is something that is designed to decrease the probability of a behavior. In order to understand positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, we also need to understand that there can be both appetitive and aversive stimuli. Appetitive stimuli are things that I like and things that I want, whereas an aversive stimulus is something that I wish to avoid. So, in the case of reinforcement, when I'm trying to encourage a behavior, I can do that by applying an appetitive stimulus, by giving you something that you want in order to get that behavior out of you. Or I can remove an aversive stimulus. I can take something away that's annoying you. This one's often a little difficult for people to conceptualize. So if we think about it in the Skinner box, one way I might encourage the animal to stay on the right side of the cage is by applying a positive reinforcer, that is, applying an appetitive stimulus, like we talked about earlier, where we're feeding the animal when it's in the right half of the cage. But I could also increase the probability of that behavior through negative reinforcement. That is, through removing an aversive stimulus when the animal is on the right half of the cage. I could, for instance, play an irritating noise, and then when the animal moves to the right half of the cage, lower the volume or turn off that noise. That removal of an aversive stimulus, the removal is the negative part, but increasing the probability of behavior is the reinforcement part. So I'm increasing the probability of behavior by removing an aversive stimulus. Punishment is designed to reduce the probability of behavior. And positive and negative punishment are often even more difficult to understand. But remember, positive just means the application of a stimulus, and punishment just means something that's designed to reduce a behavior. So most punishment you probably think of when you think of punishment is positive punishment. It's applying an aversive stimulus. It's playing a noise when you're not doing what I want you to do. Negative punishment is the removal of an appetitive stimulus. This is something like grounding. For instance, you want to do that thing? Well, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to remove your ability to do that appetitive thing. I'm going to take away, in the case of a Skinner box, I'm going to remove access to food and water when you're not doing what I want you to do. These concepts of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment are critical to understanding operant theory. To really understand operant theory, you have to think about how behavior might be shaped through these processes, and when reinforcement is more effective than punishment. In fact, in most cases, reinforcement is dramatically more effective than punishment. Once you understand how reinforcement works through the application of positive and negative reinforcement, you can understand how varying the schedules of that reinforcement can influence behavior in different ways. This is one of the most fascinating things about operant conditioning to me, is the ways in which we can vary the reinforcement structure and how much of an enormous impact that can have on human and other animal behavior. This is an example of the 4 different schedules of reinforcement described in your text. We'll begin by talking about ratio schedules of reinforcement. When animals are acquiring a behavior, most of the time we put them on a continuous reinforcement schedule. That is, every time the animal does the behavior that we want them to do, they get reinforced for that, because we want to acquire that behavior as quickly as possible. You can see on the y-axis of this graph the number of responses of lever pushing that are encouraged by different schedules of reinforcement. On the far left is the fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. In this case, every 150 times the animal responds, it receives a reinforcer. This produces a very steady and very high rate of response. In the case of the variable ratio, the animal only knows that it will receive a reinforcer, but the range of responses in which it receives those reinforcers varies from trial to trial. So it might be that they receive a reinforcer on the 5th press of the button, but it may not be until the 500th press of the button. All they know is that eventually one will emerge. This produces a very high rate of response and quite a resistance to extinction, because the animal is used to pressing the lever for a long time without receiving a reinforcer. But not only can we vary the number of times an animal has to respond before it receives a reinforcer, we can vary the amount of time that a reinforcer is available. In the case of a fixed interval, no matter how many times the animal responds, reinforcement is only available every X amount of time. So for example, a reinforcer is only available every 10 minutes. What will happen in this case is that the animal's behavior will exhibit a sort of scalloped pattern that you can see on the graph below, where just before the time that the reinforcer should be available, response rates increase rapidly. Immediately following, the animal learns that no reinforcer will be available, and so that behavior stops. Let's say you work in a factory making widgets. If you know that your boss comes by to peek in and see what you're doing exactly every 10 minutes, your work rate might look something very much like this. The variable interval pattern of reinforcement produces the most steady and consistent rate of responding. What this means is that reinforcement is only available after a variable amount of time. The reinforcer could be available in 1 minute, or it could be available in 75 minutes. It's unknown. What this produces is a steady but relatively slow state of responding to see, is it available yet? No? Might as well wait a few seconds. Is it available now? So far, we've been thinking about these things in the context of non-human animal behavior, but this is also how we learn, and it's a very powerful way to motivate yourself to learn anything. Consider this week how you can use the schedules of reinforcement to promote studying behavior in this course. How can you learn this material better using these principles? I am super interested in the power of operant conditioning. I respond really well to gamification. This might be a concept you're familiar with, the idea of earning points or badges for doing certain things. There are lots of social apps that have gamified components, like fitness apps or Foursquare, or really anything with a badge-like component. Gamification leverages basic psychological learning principles to help promote certain kinds of behavior. Marketing teams are using gamification incredibly well, but I think we can leverage gamification towards better ends. That if we can promote positive behaviors and give people points and badges for doing so, that will help motivate those behaviors, like recycling and other problems that we'll discuss in the social psychology chapter. Learning and behavioral theory is a huge part of both the history and modern practice of psychology. I hope you've enjoyed learning this section, and I look forward to your responses on the discussion board about this content this week.